Welcome, and thanks for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, we encourage you to please leave us a rating and a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening to this. This really helps other folks find out about the podcast, our great guests, and the wisdom that they have to share. So without further ado, on to today's episode.
Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and I'll be your host today. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our guest, Mr. Tim Lampkin, CEO of Higher Purpose Co. and co-founder of Capway. How are you doing today, Tim?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Brad?
Doing well. I imagine, we're recording this just before the holidays, and I'm kind of imagining that Christmas in Mississippi is a little bit different than some of us up here a little further north. Is it still pretty warm down there?
Yeah, it's still quite warm, 60, 70 degrees, depending on what day it is. But we're definitely in the holiday spirit and just excited to be with family and friends to celebrate just an amazing year going into 2018. Really excited about the things that are going to happen.
Well, very cool. So I wonder if you could kind of give us a little bit of your background on how you came to be doing what you're doing now and how you define what it is that you do now.
Awesome. So I have 10 years of community economic development experience, particularly in the Mississippi Delta, which is the Northwest region of Mississippi. We're about an hour and a half away from Memphis, Tennessee, to give people a kind of a geographic picture of where we are. And so I've been doing this work mostly with community. And I talk about this a lot in a lot of my presentations that, I do things with the community, not to the community. And it's so important for me to really be a part of the change and really be a part of the solution. And so honestly, when I got into this work, it was really driven by just helping people. And I really didn't even know what community and economic development was. I just wanted to help people. I was, I remember years ago, I was, talking to my mentor that has passed since then. His name was Reuben Smith. And, he told me, he said, if you do what you love and you love what you do, you'll never have a sad day in your life. And I figured out that it was people. I was excited about helping people, even though that, I had come from a single parent home, low income. It was just something about using my talents and my gifts and my knowledge to help others. And so I found the world of community economic development. And so I've been doing this work for quite some time in different capacities with city and county government, working with those organizations, working with local nonprofits, and then eventually working for a rural development bank, leading their community development strategy, and then branching off to lead my own consulting firm, which had, gave me the opportunity to start my nonprofit and going into some other ventures. But as a whole, I see myself as a social entrepreneur, right? So there's a mission and there's a margin. And so I really just try to make sure that there's a balance. I never really try to elevate the margin over the mission because for me, it's much deeper than what the balance sheet says. It's much deeper than the revenue. So it's about that social impact, right? How many people's lives can we change? How can we help people move out of poverty and really, move the needle as most people talk about as it relates to real community change.
That's so fascinating. There's so much to unpack there. I'm intrigued by this place at the end where you define yourself as a social entrepreneur, and I think that we're seeing more and more folks that are recognizing the importance of putting mission in there. But I wonder kind of how you go about making sure that those are balanced and that you need to make money, but you also need to make sure the mission is there. So how do you, when you're working on any particular project, how do you know when to prioritize what?
Well, I believe in terms of prioritizing, margin. Margin is so important, right? Because that's the way you keep the lights on within your organization. And so I have the academic background in business, but also just the practical experience working with numbers and working with different organizations and different kinds of business models. And so I think for me, it's important first to identify what the organization really represents, right? So this is beyond what the mission statement is. And so I take some of the practices from the traditional business industry where we talk about brand. So what is the brand? For most times, the brand is not what you say it is. It's what people think it is. And so for me, I spend a lot of time in all the ventures really building up that brand and brand awareness and making sure people understand what we really do, particularly in the space of, my nonprofit, Higher Purpose Co. We spent the last two years really building up a brand. We've been doing all kinds of workshops and trainings for entrepreneurs, but however, at the same time, simultaneously building a brand. And then with that, you can kind of almost think about it in a kind of a analogy of thinking about trading, right? So we're trading on our brand as it relates to the margin, right? So because we're able to get brand recognition, because people know who we are, we use that as leverage when we go to our different partners to say, hey, can you give us some money to continue to do the work that we're doing because of this awareness, because of this brand that we built around the good work, the mission-driven work that we're doing. As it relates to my for-profit company, Capway, we focus on the unbanked and underbanked, but again, it's a for-profit company. And so with that, it's a different structure because it's a financial technology company, a fintech company. So it's a little bit more appealing to investors and large funds that are looking to support social impact companies. And so for that piece, it's been really just trying to prove what we're doing works, showing the value, and then repeating that over and over again, and finding the right partners for us. And so it's been a really interesting balance or journey, I would say, for me, kind of living in between this for-profit and nonprofit world. But when I bring them both together, like, it's amazing the kind of conversations I have, the kind of knowledge that I'm able to share between the different entities. So it's exciting, but it's always a challenge. Building any kind of profitable business is a challenge. And I think also when you look at it from a nonprofit perspective, you see there's a huge trend where a lot of nonprofits are either branching off and creating social enterprises to actually sustain the actual programming. And so, again, that's taking these traditional business practices, elevating the work, but also increasing the margin so that the lights can stay on. So I think that's so important that you really find that balance and find what works for you within your community. But I think the whole concept of really building that awareness in the community from a nonprofit perspective allows you to do that trading I talked about to get people to support you financially.
There's so much to dig into there, but I do want to take a moment and just say that one of the things that I appreciate so much about your work is that you're you're a fairly young person working in rural communities, very underprivileged communities often, and I'm intrigued to know kind of when you look at these small communities, the economic development and community development in cities has kind of been established, and we've seen where that's gone the past 15 years with placemaking and all the other exciting things that have happened in places like D.C. and New York and L.A. and beyond. But that work is it's very different in small cities or even smaller communities and towns. And I wonder kind of how you go about having these conversations and getting people to embrace their kind of creative side and look forward instead of just backwards in these rural small communities?
That's a great question, and it's something that I've been thinking deeply about. I've had the opportunity to travel a bit across the country this year to several rural communities, all kinds of communities actually of different sizes and different demographics. And so one of the common trends that I've noticed is that all these communities are suffering from something, right? Are dealing with some kind of deficit, right? And so what I have started really talking about is how do we turn those deficits into assets? How do we look at those obstacles as opportunities? And how do we really define what I call the DNA of our community? Because every community is different, right? So we could compare ourselves to Atlanta, we can compare ourselves to a Charlotte, but we're not going to have the same assets. We're not going to have the same resources. And yes, we have people living in these communities, but those people are a little bit different from the people that live here, right? So there may be a different set of values, a different set of morals. They may have a artist-based community. They may have all kinds of different aspects of their community that we don't have. So really, what we need to do is kind of just, dissect our community and say, what are we good at? What are we passionate about? And how can we take those things to impact X? So X could be housing. It could be food access. It could be healthcare. And so really looking at everything that makes us wonderful, everything that makes us unique and special as a community, and really using that from a collective impact perspective, right? So I think part of the challenge, however, is, you will continue to see this in all communities. And honestly, I've heard this so many times where people say, well, we just need to stop working in silos. And they say this at the meetings where there's 10 to 12 other organizations, and they say, we need to stop working in silos. And for me, that really frustrates me at this point. Like a couple of years ago when I heard it, I was like, yeah, I get it. Yeah. And I have even said it myself in the past. But now, if you're at this meeting, if you're at these events where you can engage, it's not the right time to say, let's stop working in silos, because that's the whole purpose of the meeting. And so part of it is just really being thoughtful and intentional about what we say and how we interact with each other. But so that's kind of the human interaction, right? So how do we talk to each other? How do we think about our communities differently as a collective, right? Before we even talk about the actual implementation of the work, right? So for me, it's first working on ourselves as community, as people, as neighbors, as friends. Once we get to a place where we can actually sit down and have a conversation and we can actually talk to each other and actually engage in sometimes civil discourse, then we can really tackle whatever that big problem in our community is. But a lot of people do it reverse. They identify whatever that big problem is in the community, right? So a hospital is closing, and so they have a big meeting and they talk about the hospital closing. And so, but they never really understand, talking to each other, is the key to this, because there are a lot of different personalities and opinions. And so, and I know for some people that may think that's kind of, outrageous or unorthodox in terms of that strategy. But what I have noticed is a lot of people over the last year, and so we just have to learn to stop talking to each other. Right? What happened to the whole concept of neighbors, and really understanding who your neighbor is and what they do and where they go to school, like, really the whole essence of community. And I think we have to get back to that to alleviate, to address some of these broader issues in terms of, brain drain in our community or, local economic development. So for me, that's been a very passionate subject to talk about. But I think we've seen some progress in terms of communities really coming together. And then finally, I think, too, when we were able to sit down and have a conversation, we're able to talk about the solution. The third piece, in my mind, is finding those unlikely partners to be a part of the work, right? Who is not at the table? And think about it from this perspective. Who do we need to take the table to, right? Because I think a lot of times, we're in positions where we feel like if we invite everyone with a title, we've done community engagement, right? And what I mean by that is, we invite the mayor's council, we invite the commissioners, we invite the head of economic development, the superintendent of the school district. We invite all the people with the titles, right? And I think they're very important to any kind of community development strategy, any kind of community engagement. However, there is a whole other group of people that don't have titles, that don't necessarily resonate with the kind of traditional town hall format meeting. And so how do you reach them? And how do you bring them a part of the work? How do you give them an opportunity to share their opinion, even if they're the shade tree mechanic, even if they're a retired teacher that just volunteers, right? So I think it's making sure that when we're talking about community development, community change, is that we are able to we have an obligation actually to make sure that we bring in the voices that historically have not been heard, right? From whatever perspective that may look a bit different in the community that you live in, but it could be the Hispanic community, it could be the African American community, it could be the religious community, right? And as we go on and go on, you would find that somebody has always been excluded from the conversation. And so as we think about really tackling the problems in our community, we have to make sure that we provide a safe space for those to share their opinions and share their voices. So I think that's important. And I know that was a long kind of response to your question, but I believe there's so much to kind of unpack there. But that strategy has been something that I've been really refining more and more as I go deeper into the work that I'm doing.
Well, it certainly resonates. I think that, we've certainly seen that on a national scale and even beyond, that this question of how do we engage with the right people and make sure we have the right people at the table is becoming one of the crucial issues of this entire conversation. And I'm intrigued to hear you kind of phrase it as these conversations that we have to have. And I'm wondering, often when we invite these people, particularly these people with titles to the table, but really anybody to the table, how do we make sure that we're giving people a voice, but we're also listening to those other folks around us? How do you kind of make sure that those conversations are authentic and lead to actual things, as opposed to just, being the kind of staid things that don't go anywhere that we've often seen public engagement campaigns be in the past?
Well, that kind of goes back to my initial comments that I made around doing things with community. And so I believe, when you think about, the whole concept of human-centered design, I think you're starting to see more organizations incorporate that. And not just, community-based organizations, but, I've seen municipalities and county governments starting to integrate human-centered design into, their framework. And part of that is, if we're working on something, that's really important to the community, part of this interaction is bringing in community members, bringing in people, not only just to give feedback on what we have come up with, but actually help design it, actually help create it, actually have ownership, right, in whatever we're working towards. And so that's the most effective way to get people involved, to get people excited. And when we talk about sustainability, if you're able to rally 50 to 75 people early on in your project, and they have ownership and they really take this project on, that means they're telling other people about it. And that number is going to grow. It's going to grow. And when you're talking about, donors and getting additional financial support, that really adds to, the overall pot of money, and you'll be able to leverage that. And so I think it's very key that you make sure that not only you invite people to meetings, but you actually make time for them on the agenda, that they have complete belief and faith that whatever they say is not going to be looked down upon, that they don't have to say it a certain way. They don't have to use certain words. They just speak and they just share what they're thinking, what they're feeling. Because I think part of it is, too, when we think about community engagement, you said, the right people, right? And for me, I think every person in the community is the right person, right? And so I think we have to continue to kind of push the envelope when we talk about who should be in the room, who shouldn't be in the room. And to be honest with you, part of the challenge for a lot of organizations, a lot of communities, it's not necessarily, if we're thinking about this in a traditional way, it's not necessarily getting the right people in the room, right? It's part of it is getting the people that probably would disagree with this, probably would fight this in the community, probably have no intentions of supporting this. And to be honest, those are the people that should be in the room as well. Because what you don't want to happen is that you start this momentum, you start moving forward, and because you completely have excluded parts of your community, because that, they're not going to vote on this, they're not going to agree with this, you completely ignore them. And honestly, it's our responsibility to hear every perspective, every opinion in the community about what's happening, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not about you, it's not about me, it's about community. It's not about, the mayor, it's not about all these other people that have these titles, because they went into this position, they went into this office, hopefully for the community. And so I think that's part of the challenge, is really making sure that we have not only the cheerleaders in the room, but sometimes we need to have some of the naysayers in the room as well, to get both sides of the story, to get both perspectives, and really try to build that common ground. So I think that's really important, Brad, and we have to continue to work towards that if we want to see sustainable initiatives and projects in our community.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for mega regions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So a big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guest. Thank you. Absolutely. That's a compelling picture you paint there. And I wonder as well that I think that part of the complexity that we've seen here in Roanoke and when we're trying to get people to the table is that there are these communities that you mentioned earlier, these underprivileged communities, whether they be the African American community, the Hispanic community, wherever they're coming from, that they often are hard to get out. But often I think that there's some evidence that that's because they've not been listened to many times in the past, that they've come forward and said, hey, this is not something we want. This is something that you're pushing on us from above. How do we make sure that that doesn't happen again? And how do you kind of rebuild that trust that's so crucial to making that happen?
I was honestly thinking about trust in my head when you were talking. So, I had a good friend to tell me that, change only happens at the speed of trust. Mm. And so when you think about it from that perspective, I think a lot of times, too, when we're talking about community projects, sometimes we're just in a rush, right? We're in a rush to get things done. Maybe because we have the funding that we need now. Maybe it seems that everything is in place and we need to move on this. We need to make it happen right now. But part of the work, and I think in a lot of communities, particularly smaller communities, it's really having the patience to understand that sometimes things are not going to go as planned. Sometimes things are going to be delayed, but it's also having the patience to build those relationships, to build that trust in the community, so you can have a true representation of the community as it relates to a particular project. To kind of speak to the first part of your question, when you basically take a population of a community and they have historically have not been listened to. Historically, their voices have been suppressed, right? And then you offer them only a part of the project or only engage them because it's the right thing to do. It's the checklist kind of mindset versus the intentional, I want them involved. They need to be involved. How do we get them involved? Like, that becomes a problem because people in those communities, particularly communities of color, we understand that. We've seen it. It's the old playbook, right? And so I think it's important that you first recognize whatever that historical context is in your community, and then you be very intentional and very genuine about engaging that population. And sometimes it takes a while, but however long it takes, I think the relationship, that trust, will be definitely worth it to the broader community. The other aspect of this is kind of going back to what I previously said, is making sure that not only you give them an opportunity to engage and to share their opinion, but the feedback that they give is actually included. It's somehow integrated, right? So this comes down to negotiation 101. This comes down to compromising. And it could be something simple as the location of the new park, right? It could be simple as moving the park 2 blocks over, right? But that community as a whole has a new park, right? And so I think it's really trying to be open to feedback, because I've seen time and time again, people in certain organizations, certain places have opened up this feedback platform where they want feedback. At least they give off this perception that they do, and it was really just it was just a show, right? It was just to say we did it, right? Let's just say we're going to do a community town hall meeting just to say we did it, but we're really not going to listen to what they tell us, even though they elected us, even though that this is taxpayers' dollars that we're using, even though, right, these people in the community will be using this facility. And so we have to really get out of that mindset and really do things for the benefit of the overall community. And and it's not easy at all, Brad. So I hope that you're not getting the sense that I'm saying, oh, this could happen overnight. No, it's not easy at all. But if you have the right people, the right intention, and you couple that with the right organizations involved, I think that's going to be the key to really having success in community. But it starts with really wanting and desiring change, right? And people know when you're genuine. Like that's especially in small communities. Like people know when you're genuine, and when you're genuine and you're doing it for the overall benefit of the community, it's much easier to accomplish.
Well, I was really struck when you were talking there about, you mentioned relationships in there and this authenticity and this genuineness. And what I'm thinking is that, so often we go into these conversations in these communities and these public engagement campaigns, and really all we want to hear from these folks is about this particular project. And those relationships don't go beyond, what do you think about this park? What do you think about this new housing complex? What do you think about this? That there's not, those relationships are very stilted in that they're only interested in that particular part. And it goes back to kind of your earlier point about what would happen if we just had authentic relationships where we would talk about anything in our lives with these folks that are from different communities than ourselves.
Yes, and I think that, we have, this year has been really challenging for a lot of communities that are really trying to redefine themselves. And, it has really forced people to talk to each other and really have those heart-to-heart conversations about the longevity of communities, longevity of projects and initiatives that people deeply care about. But I think, Brad, and this may sound just so kind of left field, but, I think sometimes we forget that we're people. And, I think we get caught up in kind of the day-to-day, right? That, I have this title, I run this organization, I do this, I do that, I got these responsibilities. Right? We get caught up in our own little world and our own little thing, and we just forget that we're human, that under all of those titles, under all of the suits and the dresses and the mixers and the meetings, that we're people. And, one of the greatest things that I have been able to witness is that when communities really want something, when there's a unified effort, like it's impossible to stop that community. It's impossible to really break down any kind of progress that they have because they're so unified. They're so on the same page. They get it. Everybody gets it. And that kind of goes back to, what I was talking about earlier, that DNA of your community, right? And it could be that your community is just resilient. Your community understands how to waver through the difficult times, and part of your DNA is perseverance. Part of your DNA is creativity. You have the most creative people in this region, in this country, right? So I think that's what gives me hope, and I believe that once we can come together and talk about not only the current issue, but really what's the state of our community, and how do we ensure that the next generation continues to lead the way, continues to be a part of this change. And I think that's part of the strategy that I have been able to utilize is, being the young voice, adding that youthfulness to this work. I think it's important that every community continues to find ways to engage the next generation of leaders. And, some communities have, youth councils. Some communities have organizations where they engage youth to a certain degree, but we have to make sure those voices don't get lost as well, because we understand there are, these leadership dynamics, right? Where, millennials are not necessarily seen as, to be taken seriously at times, or we want things so fast. I think it's important that we continue to uplift all kinds of voices that are historically have been suppressed and not heard. And part of that sustainability is including, young people like myself, that make sure that we're not only invited to the meeting, but we actually have a role, that we actually have an opportunity to share, and, that we're not just sitting in the room, but we're actually at the table.
So, this is, you've mentioned these communities where everyone comes together and they have a shared vision, and that they've engaged, the different parts of the population to make this happen. But what do you, like when you go into a community that hasn't quite gotten there, that either the establishment isn't listening to new ideas, or that they've purposely quieted a certain portion of the population, or, whether that be young people or whoever, how do you kind of start to open those doors up? Or is it just a matter of you have to have something before you can start, or where does that willingness to get to that shared vision come from?
Well, I think part of it is the willingness comes from kind of going kind of the path less traveled, right? So, thinking about, how do we go against kind of the status quo in our community? How do we introduce and talk about new ideas? How do we completely, throw away kind of the concept of thinking outside the box, right? And I normally say, let's just throw the whole box away, because that within that self, creates restrictions. And so I think, part of it is just, having a new way of thinking. But it is difficult when you have a community that's not trying to move forward as a whole. But you have to find the kind of the sunshine in the dark place, as I described it, and find that organization that has the greatest reach, right? The most respect and the greatest reputation in your community, and it could be that it could be the local housing organization. It could be the soup kitchen, right? It could be the homeless shelter. It could be the hospital. Finding that entity that touches everybody that you're trying to pull in, right? Because see, this is a new concept too, where I've seen the traditional conveners not necessarily using their power to convene the right way. So when you think about convening, the power of convening, we traditionally think that, our elected officials have the power to convene, and that's the only people that should be able to convene, right? And that's true. And I think if, someone called a meeting in my hometown that's elected official, people are going to come out, right? Because that kind of structure, that position kind of gives you that power to convene. But outside of that, there are other organizations that have the power to convene, but they are only doing or only in a lane that they're comfortable in right now, right? So I have the power to convene on food access because I run the local food pantry. And so every time I bring people together, we're only going to talk about food and how do we get food, to the people that really need it. But that convening power can be transferred. But the most exciting part about this, Brad, is when it's multiplied with another organization that has the power to convene as well. And so when I talked about earlier these unlikely partners, so now you may have the local food pantry working with the hospital or working with the homeless shelter, and they have this power to convene not only on the issue of homelessness or food access, but now they're talking about this overall community development strategy to alleviate poverty in their community, right? And so that's where all that magic and the special things start to happen, because it causes people to think differently. And, you know, we've been socialized to kind of think in these compartments, right? You know, housing people do housing, healthcare people do healthcare, right? Economic development folks do economic development stuff, right? But if we're able to unlock that and give ourselves almost permission to think beyond what we're currently experiencing, what we're currently seeing, you will see a lot of transformation and revitalization to start happening in our communities. And so that's kind of a strategy that you could use when a community as a whole is not on the same page, when leadership is not kind of moving, in the right direction. You find those conveners and utilize them to elevate the conversation because they already have connections in the community. They already have respect from the community. And most of the time, they're going to have some kind of resources, financial resources, social capital, you name it, to really move the needle forward as it relates to the overall community. So I think that's a very, and I've seen that happen in a few different places, not necessarily, wasn't there up close and personal seeing the work, but I've seen it from a distance. And I was like, wait, that's pretty amazing what they just did, right? That's pretty interesting, what they just, started to work on. So I think that's a very unique way to kind of bypass the naysayers or the negativity and continue to do the work. So I hope that's a helpful suggestion.
Well, absolutely. And I wonder, you've been to so many communities at this point, whether it's through traveling or through places that you've gone to work. I wonder, when you go to a new place, what are the things that you kind of look at to let you know, well, things are going well here, or, well, there's something, there needs to be a change here? What are kind of those indicators that you see that tip you off one way or another?
So this may sound really crazy, but every time I go to a new community, I always try to talk to someone I don't know, of course. I just speak to someone randomly and say, hey, how's everything going here in this community? And that interaction really, we talk about first impressions, and there are a lot of organizations and, local economic development organizations that do kind of first impression surveys. And so, but that's kind of a tell-all for me, because, again, we're talking about, some of these communities are really small. And so if you live in a community that is, I would say, under 10,000 people, for me, if I, stop someone on the street and just, hey, how's everything going in this community? And that person can't really tell me anything promising. If it's all negative, that's a red flag for me. And I do a very good job being very open, and I always look for diverse people. I never look for people that I think will give me just this polished answer. So, I don't talk to necessarily my first impression. I don't talk to the local chamber director initially. I really just, I may ask the person working at the gas station or the local McDonald's or, so I'm really intentional about that. So that's kind of the first thing I do. And then after all of that, I look at, the number of businesses and how the businesses are doing. And you can always tell, how the businesses are doing depending on kind of the the kinds of businesses, the range of amenities that a communities have. And so I always look at that. And then I look kind of too at kind of the resources. So this is very broad. But, if it's natural resources, how is that community leveraging those natural resources to, provide a better quality of life for communities. And then because of, my passion for arts and culture, I definitely look at how is the local culture being elevated here, and really to dive deeper. And this may go a little bit outside of what you asked me, but I really think about what's the story of this community, right? What's the story, and who's creating that story, and how is that story being told? And that really, like, when I can look at everything else and I can talk to all these other people, but that last part about the story of the community and who creates the story and how is it told, that really, for me, like, it gives me everything I need. Because if you talk about your community in a way that is compelling, but also authentic and genuine. And when we say authentic, sometimes people only try to kind of, they try to impress themselves, right? They try to boast and brag. And I think that's important. But we live in a world today where I think people appreciate not only the good, but a little bit of, some of the trials and tribulations, right? Some of the struggles, some of the things that happened that really forced you to think about reframing your mindset about your community, helped you to rebrand your community. And I think it's okay that we add some of that, right? Not that we basically hold on to, what is the bad thing, but if we embrace it and we look at it as a lesson, right? And we learn from that and we keep going, but we integrate that into our story. And I think about that very deeply, as it relates to, Mississippi, right? So we have a very, mixed bag of history as it relates to, the civil rights movement and all these bad things that happened to, people of color and African Americans throughout the state. And that's very bad. But part of that is, how did we overcome some of those things, right? And so don't get me wrong, we're not there yet. But part of that forced people to say, this is not right. We shouldn't be doing this. We need to change our perspective. We need to change the way we do things. And so I think it's important that we do a really great job of, like, telling our story and making sure that the right people create that story. And so I think that's so crucial for me to understanding a community, really understand where that community is and really trying to visualize where they're going in the next 3 to 5 years.
That's I love that in so many ways. It's something that we've been talking about here in Roanoke a lot recently. So, for instance, we have 2 City Lab articles that came out about Roanoke in the past 6 months. One of them was very complimentary. Look at this Appalachian town that's doing well. The other one was about how we have continued to victimize the African-American community in town and not giving them the voice that they need. And it's really interesting because in some ways both of those narratives are true in many ways, but how do we build this overarching narrative that includes both of those things and the other complexities in it? And I wonder if, just from personal curiosity, do you have any communities that you've looked at that have really done a good job of telling their story in a way that includes all of those warts, but also includes the successes as well?
Yes, I could share some of those communities. Unfortunately, I can't really go into descriptions of the names because of some other obligations I have. But I would say that you're not alone in this challenge. And the biggest thing that I've seen a lot of people do is that they really confront that issue, right? They don't try to shy away from it. They don't run away. They really take ownership of what has happened, and they work collectively to address it to make sure it never happens again. And I understand that the narrative, right, is always going to be complex. And when you talk, you're talking about articles, you just never know what kind of framing the journalist may have. But I think it's also important here to note that we have to, going back to the platform, creating these platforms so these stories can be heard. And so that may take people in your own community writing, storytelling, producing content about what has happened. That way you have the control and the ownership of the story, right? I think all these other publications are great to have some kind of outlet, but they should be taking the lead from the local community. The local community should be framing the story in a way, again, that's transparent, that's authentic, that's genuine, that's addressing whatever the issues are. But again, it's hard for what I've seen, people to really go around, to really kind of call out, like if you're bad at something and you tell everybody that you're bad at something and you call it out first, it's kind of hard for someone to continue to kind of nag you with that. And so it's really just being honest about whatever that issue is in your community, and then providing that voice for it and really telling it in an authentic way. But I've seen a lot of communities, and I wish I could kind of go into some details on some of those, but it has been a challenge for a lot of communities. And I also would say, too, there was one community that, they were struggling with some things that happened in their community as it relates to, race relations. And they literally got people in a room. I don't know how they really did it, but they got people in a room that had not talked to each other. Like they would wave at each other, like, "Hey, how you doing, Brad? I'll keep going my way, you go your way." But had not talked to each other in years, and they were living in the same community. All right, and so I would say, what is separating your community, right? And some of this could be incidents that happen, right? It could be something that happened between organizations. It could be something physical, right? It could be a railroad track. It could be a park. It could be a building, right? It could be something where people just in their mind, "Oh, we don't go on that side of town," or that's not for us, that's for them, right? And it could be vice versa too, right? Depending on what entity that you're talking to. Everyone sometimes kind of points the finger at the other organization or the other population, like, "Oh, it's them, no, it's us, no, it's..." So I think part of it too is thinking about what's separating our community. And how do we come together collectively to address that? And this community that I was talking about, it was an incident that happened, and they felt the need to really address it. Now, keep in mind, I would say this particular incident with people in their community had happened multiple times, but it took someone recognizing that if we don't do anything about this now, it's going to happen again, and it's going to completely separate and divide our community, and we're no longer going to be able to really survive. Because when you get into those tensions, you get into these debates and this animosity within communities, especially small communities. Like the community as a whole feels it, and that impact really starts to hurt every single thing. And so, that's kind of my advice, to really figure out, again, like what's separating your community. Is it physical? Is it something that event that has happened? And really trying to kind of tackle that and address it like early on. And, I think you would see some progress. However, again, it's having that patience. And the other thing, too, is like I've seen so many people assume that they know how another demographic is feeling without even posing the question, right? Like, instead of saying, "Oh, I know they're not coming to the meeting because of this." Well, did you ask them? Did you ask them why they weren't coming? Did you even invite them to the meeting? Or so I think it's always kind of trying to doing away with our preconceived notions and assumptions and all of those things that really, really hinder the work, and try to get at the heart of the matter and really speak to people's needs and wants and desires, because everybody for the most part wants to have a thriving community, and it's just really getting people on the same page.
Well, I kind of hate to bring us to a close. It feels like so many different avenues that we haven't touched on that'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on. But I wonder, as we kind of get to the end of our time here, if you could share a story that about what can happen when communities do figure out and get everybody together, when they can kind of start thinking about that, or what happens when a community starts to thrive.
Well, what happens when the community starts to thrive, you will see an increase in, the overall quality of life of those communities. You will see, a reduction, in the brain drain. You will see a reduction in businesses closing. You will see the organizations coming together more frequently to rally for causes that benefit the entire community, not just, their organizations. You will see a community thriving before you actually enter it, right? So you will know as soon as you come into the welcome sign of that community, you will know this is a different kind of community. This community has a true sense of place, has a true sense of identity, and really understand like what makes their community unique and special. And so those are the things that we constantly try to work on, through the work that I do in the various different ways, with Higher Purpose. We work with, entrepreneurs and helping them understand that it's okay to build a business in this place, in the Mississippi Delta, because we have so many amazing things, despite what the media says, despite what people have told us that we're not. We want to rewrite that narrative. And when you see communities really taking ownership, and ownership in all kinds of ways, Brad, ownership in particularly the culture, ownership of our culture, ownership of land and property, but most importantly, ownership that they can thrive in this place that they call home. So I think that's really important. And then the other aspect of that too, particularly around the work that I do with Capway, it's helping people become healthy, right? And we have these communities come together. It's not just the physical health. And a lot of the work that we do with Capway, it's the financial health, right? So you'll start to see, overall household income to improve. You'll see people reducing their debt, right? A lot of these communities, smaller communities, have a huge influx of payday lenders that really prey on low-income communities. And so if a community comes together and say, we don't want this in our community, just like a lot of communities have gotten together and kind of shut out, large corporations, I think there's time for us to do similar things for the kinds of businesses, that we don't want, that really hinder the growth of the community. And so we with Capway, we spend a lot of time on educating people about financial literacy and financial education, but also giving them the access to the tools and the resources. So overall, in the work that I do with my nonprofit and my for-profit, I think if a community is really moving forward towards change and transformation, that organizations like mine can thrive, can be prosperous, and also can play a significant role in helping all these other entities that exist really improve the overall quality of life for residents. So every community is different. I would leave that, and say every community is different, and every community needs to find and figure out what makes that community special. And so what is the DNA of your community, and how can you, tell your story, and who tells your story is going to be so important to the overall success of your community.
Well, very good. That's a very compelling and way to bring it all together here at the end. And I wonder, Tim, if people are interested in learning more about what you do or finding more information out about you, where can they go to find that?
Absolutely. So you can check out my website. It's timlampkin.com, TIMLAMPKIN.com. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at Tim Lampkin. You can check out all of the initiatives and the projects and the ventures that I'm working on throughout Mississippi, but also throughout the country. And I look forward to staying in touch with everyone.
Well, very good. And if everyone is interested in learning more about CityWorks Expo, you can find us at cityworksxpo.com or on social media. But Tim, thank you so much for taking the time this morning.
Thank you so much, Brad.
Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave a rating. It really helps other people find out about our fascinating guests and find the information that we have to share. Lastly, please save the date for our upcoming event, October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia. And keep up to date by following us on Facebook and checking out our website, cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksxpo.com. Thank you guys again, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.